Yes. Hello and welcome to today's webinar on policy coherence and marine governance. This is the second of a series of webinars looking at policy coherence in European seas from different perspectives. And today we will discuss in specific how to assess coherence and how to understand policy coherence. My name is Laura Friedrich. I am a researcher in ocean governance here at the Norwegian Institute for Water Research in Oslo, and I will take you through today's webinar. Just for your information, we will have a Q&A session at the end of all of our talks today. You can share your questions in the Q&A chat throughout the webinar, and then we will get to them at the end. Now, before we dive straight into the topics, let me just introduce today's speakers. We have 5 of them, and I'll start with the room today. Here in Oslo with me, we have Frauke Maria Pjatloff. Oh, God, this had to happen. Frauke Maria Pjatloff, who is a research manager here at NIVA for the section on water and society. And she also coordinates the CrossGov project, which is producing these webinar series. And then we have Saskia Thuber, who is also a researcher here at NIVA on ocean and coastal governance. And then turning to the speakers online, we have joining from the Netherlands, we have Suvituuli Puharinen, who is an assistant professor in European law at the University of Maastricht. Hi, Suvituuli. Then we have Jonas Kuranvita, who is doing a postdoc at the University of Eastern Finland in law as well. He is currently based in Gothenburg, so is joining us from Sweden. Hi, Jonas.
Hi.
And finally, we have Gunnar Sander, who is joining us from all the way up north in Norway, in Tromsø. He is also a senior researcher at NIVA, working on marine and coastal planning questions. So thank you for joining us today. So let's go straight into the topic, and I'll start with you, Frauke. Can you tell us a bit about what policy coherence actually is, and why is it important?
Yeah, I can do that. So I will repeat a little bit from the first webinar that we had last week. Policy coherence, very shortly, it refers to how well different policies are connected and how well they work together. And what is important is it can look into the objectives of the policies and the measures of the policies, and there are different dimensions of policy coherence. So there are like horizontal coherence, vertical, and geographical. It basically, in a very short nutshell, you can say that policy coherence means that the policies are very aligned. So they are so aligned that you can exploit the synergies between the policies and the policy areas. And if policies and policy areas are sufficiently aligned, it's then when you can exploit these and you can make ocean governance more integrated and coherent. So that's an important reason for why we need policy coherence. But another reason is that policy coherence also contributes to policy effectiveness. Because if you have policies that do not work against each other, you can assume that these policies are easier to implement, they're easier to comply with, and by the end of the day, it's easier to reach the overall objectives of your policies. So that's very shortly what we mean by policy coherence. In the project, we have worked with policy coherence in a very comprehensive way. So we started on the EU level working with policies on paper. So we dived into policy coherence between the policies and the directives. And then we went all the way down to the national and the subnational levels in the context of case study areas. So there we have been discussing to what extent the policies and their implementation is still coherent on the ground. And what it enables us to do is to see where the problems actually are. Are the problems of coherence and incoherence are mainly at the design level, so at the EU level, or are they at the national level when you transpose these, or are they on the ground when different authorities and different actors need to implement these? So we have been looking into this, into different clusters of policies. So we have been looking into biodiversity and offshore wind, fisheries policies and biodiversity, but also agricultural pollution of coastal marine ecosystems. So we have been following the level of coherence from the EU to the ground in the project. Maybe also interesting for the audience today is to mention that we have also been working on developing a methodological approach to study policy coherence more systematically. And we have been using that in the project and trying to develop it and improve it over time. And currently we are working on a handbook, which is an online handbook, trying to give an easy guidance for everyone involved and everyone interested in studying policy coherence. With a step-by-step guidance. So this will be launched in June, probably. And we hope this can also inspire and help others that are interested in doing coherence analysis.
Sounds like a very complex topic then, this policy coherence, and this handbook should really be a good resource to help understand it better. Can you tell us a bit about this methodological framework? What does it look like?
Yeah, I can talk about it very shortly because the rest of the webinar is going into the different aspects and the different components of the framework. But in a very short overview, it consists of two main parts. So the first part of the framework, it allows you to study the level of policy coherence, and you can do that for one policy, and you can also do that between policies. So you look into the objectives and the measures and the instruments and see to what extent they are aligned and to what extent they actually contribute to one another. And you usually take into consideration the higher level objectives as well, because you always assess coherence in the context of something. So in our case, that was the European Green Deal. It could also be the Sustainable Development Goals or the upcoming objectives from the Oceans Pact or something like that. Then the other part of the framework helps you to assess why there is a certain level of policy coherence or incoherence. So for this, we did a division into three overarching categories of barriers and enablers. And within these, you can look into subcategories of explanations. And for all of this, we developed guiding questions. So guiding questions that helps you to evaluate your policies to make sure that you have taken into consideration different aspects and different possibilities and explanations for why there is policy coherence or incoherence.
Thank you, Frauke. We will come back to these factors a bit later, but first, let's take a deeper dive then into the first part of the assessment framework, and I will turn to Gunnar to ask, so how do you go about understanding and assessing the level of coherence between different policies? Over to you, Gunnar.
I hope you see my screen now. Do you?
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Well, to give first an overview of the methodology that Frauke introduced, it consists of three basic elements here. And the first is that, as Frauke has indicated, coherence is relational. We need to look towards something. And still we divide this in two steps, where we first look at the individual policies, which may seem a little strange, but since what we first of all are interested in is looking at clusters or groups of policies where we compare them towards each other. The reason for doing it this way is that we want to look at the individual policies as building blocks. So we kind of want to understand the single elements of a cluster before we start to dive into a more complex analysis of this cluster. So this is the first. Then we also, as Frauke has indicated, we consider objectives or goals, as well as the type and strength of measures, what you may refer to as the instrumentation of a policy. There's one thing which is important to take into account here, and that is that objectives in themselves, they do not change anything. They can inspire people to act, they can give direction on where to go, but it's the measures that can lead to change, but not when you find them on paper like you can do in a policy or in a plan. It's first when they are implemented that you really can expect to achieve a result. So here, CrossGov has tried to go a little further than other similar frameworks that mainly operate at the level of analyzing only objectives towards each other. Then we have two levels of analysis which can be conducted both for experts and or stakeholders. We have a light analysis where we have a few high-level guiding questions, and we have an in-depth analysis where we go more in detail. The light analysis you can do yourself, or you can do it as a group exercise quite easily without doing too much research. But if you want to do an in-depth analysis, you will probably need to really dive into the documents and probably interview people as well. So starting with step one, the coherence of a single policy, the building block. We can look at first the internal coherence within the policy. There are quite a few policies that have several objectives. So you can ask, are they aligned or are they in conflict with each other? For instance, there may be environmental objectives as one part of a more complex set of objectives for a policy. Then the in-depth questions are more to go in detail to, for instance, to what extent are they legally binding? Is it an obligation of best effort where you are required to do as best as you can? And if you have done as best as you can, you have fulfilled the obligation? Or are you required to actually achieve something, a target that is set, which, for instance, a reduction of emissions that should be reached, and are there exemptions? These are more detailed questions. Then we come to the next question here about the measures. And the key question here is whether the measures are likely to create results that achieve the policy's objectives. This is the typical question in an effectiveness assessment. And there is one important reason for asking it, because it can give you a better understanding of the thrust, the strength of the policy than just looking at the objectives. So one way you can, one ditch a policy can fall into is that you have a symbolic policy only. Norwegian climate policy is a good example. Over the last 35 years, politicians over and over again have come up with new objectives, but never provided good measures that support them. You see, in the in-depth questions, you ask also which sub-objectives are supported. And that goes to the policies with multiple objectives. If some of the measures support only some of the objectives, you can have an, what shall I say, an unbalanced or a skewed policy, which in fact doesn't deliver what it may seem to do, only if you look at the objectives. So by looking at both objectives and measures, you can understand more of what the policy will deliver in practice. But very often, we are also interested in understanding the relationship between the individual policy and higher level objectives, for example, from the European Green Deal or the Sustainable Development Goals. So then we can ask questions about the objectives again. Are they aligned with the European Green Deal objectives? And again, about the measures, are they likely to support the achievement of also the European Green Deal objectives? Then it's helpful to understand what the individual policy may deliver. Then an issue which we have discussed quite a lot, and that is how to select policies for comparison, how to set up a cluster. Well, if you should make a meaningful selection, there should be some kind of overlap. The subject matter, for instance, do the different policies try to regulate the same? Are they trying to reach the same target groups? And do they cover the same geography? These are probably the most fundamental ones. And it may lead you into quite wide selection of policies. For instance, looking at how general economic policies or regional policies affect certain target groups, along with the environmental policies and sectoral policies. Then we have also distinguished between two types of clusters. One is the environmental policy clusters, where we would expect that all of them to somehow work towards getting a better environment. And we would expect them to support each other towards that end. However, environmental policy is quite fragmented. And there are also so many mechanisms involved in these policies. I mean, some of them may require reducing emissions, others setting up marine protected areas, others requiring environmental impact assessment as a formal procedure before you take a decision. So here questions will be more about whether they as a sum are effective and efficient. Then we can look at environmental policies versus other policies. Here we would expect more conflicting interests and be more interested to check whether that is the case, or whether you could have coherence as Frocke has defined it. So when we come to step 2, analyzing the selected policies, remember we already have analyzed the individual's policies. So then we can ask again, are the objectives aligned? Do they support each other or counteract? So we can start by looking at the other policies in the cluster. We have kind of looked at pairs 2 and 2 as a way of building up in more complex. And then we can also look towards the overarching ambitions in high-level policies. And we can, if you look at the in-depth questions, we can revisit some of the overlaps more in detail, ask other questions about overlaps, for instance, if they have the same time frames, if they use the same indicators, do they refer to each other? For instance, a Norwegian example, aquaculture legislation on contaminants now refer to the Water Framework Directive requirements in Norway. So that is a way of building in more coherence. And then finally, the measures. How does implementing the measures of one policy affect realizing the objectives of another policy, and the same towards the European Green Deal or other overarching policies? So this was it from my side. You will get more when we have finished making the document that Frocke referred to.
Thank you very much, Gunnar. So quite a comprehensive framework there that importantly looks both at the objectives and the measures of policies, both individual and in clusters. And as Gunnar mentioned, in the CrossGov project, we tested this methodology for different clusters of policies, both focusing on environmental policies, but also sectoral. And we will now hear about 2 examples from this. So starting with the environmental policies, I will give the word to Suvi Tuli and ask, what did you find out about coherence in biodiversity and environmental policies in relation to the Green Deal?
Yes, thank you so much, Laura. Let's see, it's not in full screen yet, right? My presentation. Yeah, so there we go. All right, so I'm going to start with the how we see the policy landscape when it comes to the different Green Deal objectives or clusters of objectives. And in my presentation, I will particularly focus on the marine biodiversity. So when we start looking into the EU legal framework governing the marine environment at the moment, we notice that we have overarching ecosystem management instruments like the Water Framework Directive and the Marine Strategy Framework Directive that pretty much encompass all these 3 different streams of objectives within them. But when we go to the more specifically to each individual cluster, we found that there is a different group of instruments that come into play in actually steering towards the objectives of that cluster. Here we can both see that sometimes it is multiple environmental instruments that govern these clusters. For instance, with the marine biodiversity, we have nature conservation instruments as well as the VFD and the MSFD. And then, of course, also there are important other sectoral policies, such as the Common Fisheries Policy for Marine Biodiversity. But as Gunnar explained, we soon noticed that it invites a little bit different questions, whether we assess the coherence of different environmental policies, what kind of coherent approach and framework they create in steering the environmental ambition. And then it's a little bit different question of how the economic sectoral policy interacts with the environmental protection. So that's why we decided to first go into the intra-environmental policy coherence, and in this presentation also show our results with the marine biodiversity cluster. So if we recall the policy ambitions that the Green Deal sets forward for marine biodiversity, those have been outlined in the Green Deal, and then the biodiversity strategy adopted 1 year afterwards. And here we have perhaps the most well-known objective. So first of all, there's an objective to increase the percentage of ocean space that is conserved with the marine protection areas. And there the goal is that we protect 30% of the sea area by 2030, where 1/3 of which is under strict protection. But marine biodiversity protection, of course, we cannot really achieve a good condition of ecosystem by just putting in place marine protection areas, but we also have to pay attention into how effectively the nature is then protected. So then we can also see that in the objectives, we have a focus on ensuring that those protected areas are managed effectively, we restore degraded ecosystem and habitats, and we also prevent negative impacts. On a European level, we can see that we are still falling a bit short from the area protection targets, but even a bigger problem has been the effective management of the protection areas and ensuring that also other habitats and ecosystems that are currently outside the protection areas do not deteriorate. And as I already showed in the first picture, these are the policy ambitions from the Green Deal. But of course, in order to actually steer towards achievement of these, we need to find out how the current legislation operationalizes and steers towards these objectives. So we started with the objectives of these policies according to the CrossGov methodology. And I want to note here that in these 4 different instruments, so the Water Framework Directive, Nature Directives, which is actually 2 directives, but we treat it as one whole, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and the Nature Restoration Law that was adopted last year. In all of these, the directive employs a regulatory strategy where most of the substantive legal obligations come forward from environmental objectives that have been established, and the member states have obligations to reach, and which also create rules governing activities at the sea space. So these objectives are not only policy ambitious, but they are actually the core substance, the core normative content of these directives. We started looking into the coherence of these objectives based on 5 elements. So the coverage of marine nature, the content, the deadline timeframes, the legal bindingness of these objectives, but also exemptions. And what we found out is that from each of these 5 perspectives, these 4 instruments display significant fragmentation in terms of that they are not really explicitly aligned. When we go to the coverage of marine nature and the content of objectives, we can see that these directives deal a little bit different aspects of the marine nature and also establish the objective in a little bit different words. But there we could see that through interpretation, we can find alignment. It is possible through interpretation, especially. But then when we go to other aspects, such as the deadlines for the objectives or the exemptions, we find that it is quite dispersed, and even with the interpretation, it is quite hard to find a serious alignment of these objectives. When it comes to legal status, we found that many of these instruments, there are clear and legally binding rules when it comes to adoption of new projects that go at odds against these objectives. But when it comes to member states' obligation, like for instance, what do the member states have to do with agricultural nutrient pollution or fisheries or shipping activities or these types of like different sectors than only permitting of new projects, we found that actually all of these legal instruments are still rather unclear what the legal obligations to the member states are. The Marine Strategy Framework Directive being the most vague on this aspect. Well, going to the instruments, there we found that these 4 directives, of course, they put forward various different kinds of instruments, but we can quite nicely see that there is potential for them to work together in a quite coherent policy landscape. So at the landscape level, we can see that we have the broader ecosystem management instruments, such as the marine strategies and the water river basin management plans, as well as the marine spatial planning that ensure that can help member states in thinking about the overall policy landscape. What instruments are there? What needs to be protected? What are the management actions that need to be taken? Within this overall framework, we can see that different aspects of the Green Deal objectives are covered by the instruments. So first of all, we have the MPAs that would be predominantly stemming from the Natura 2000 network from the nature directives, as well as the MSFD that provides that supplementary MPAs can be established. So this would be the instruments for realizing the 30% objective. However, what we found is that here, especially the MSFD, leaves a lot of flexibility on the member states to actually decide how to choose the MPAs. And neither one of these instruments actually prescribes strict protection at the outset. So that's also something that the directives leave for member states. When it goes to restoration, we implicitly have restoration of obligations for the Natura 2000 areas, as well as under the MSFD, because it requires the member states to achieve good status of, for instance, marine ecosystems and habitats. Yet, especially for the MSFD, because of the legal status of the objectives has been unclear, we now have the nature restoration law that was adopted to explicitly provide legally binding restoration obligations, which has the potential to support these 2 other directives here. However, maybe here a challenge is that the nature restoration law's timeframe goes well beyond, especially the MSFD's deadlines, which is a slight discrepancy here. And then finally, when we go to reducing impacts, I already said that most of these directives put forward some rules regarding permitting of new projects, but they also put forward some exemptions. So while at the same time, this might seem like a nice alignment and coherence positive feature that there are permitting rules, it actually causes quite a bit of fragmentation and discrepancy. So for instance, depending where the project is situated, a project like offshore wind park might be, in worst case scenario, subject to 4 different permitting rules and exemptions under the different directives and regulation. And then in some other locations, it might be that none of these instruments actually bind the adoption process. So there's serious discrepancy there. And finally, when it goes to other pressures than really projects, we find that these directives don't readily address those, but it comes increasingly to the sectoral economic policy and the degrees of which these environmental objectives are integrated there. So key findings, as I already said, we found that the current EU policy landscape, the legal landscape on protecting marine biodiversity, is seriously fragmented and also has some problems in terms of effectiveness to deliver the Green Deal's objectives. The biggest problems are that actually none of these instruments comprehensively address marine nature. They have different delimitations. And even the ones that are the most comprehensive, so the MSFD, we are still unclear what are the legal implications. So none of the instruments really put forward comprehensive, legally binding obligations on marine nature protection. We have serious discrepancy on the timelines and exemptions, which might allow member states to postpone action, even if one of the directives would actually require it earlier. And as I showed from the last slide, we have potential in finding an instrument mix that can be quite comprehensive and supplementary, but there are still weaknesses that remain there as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suvi Tuli. Quite a complex picture then before we even get to the sectoral policies. I was just wondering, so the project focused specifically on the Green Deal and kind of ocean governance in the context of the Green Deal, but now everyone is wondering about this Oceans Pact and what that will mean. So could you just share briefly with us what your thoughts are on that and whether the Oceans Pact will help or can help deliver some more coherence in these marine policies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do find that when it comes to the marine biodiversity protection, we have enough laws in place. So the number of instruments seems to be already comprehensive. However, what we would need is interpretive guidance and some more focus paid into how these policies actually work together. And I see that the Ocean Pact could provide an opportunity to explicitly maybe outline this a little bit more, to commit, for instance, doing some guidance, etc. But even the more pressing question than having more policy agendas or policies or legislation is now the implementation and enforcement of these directives. I find that especially the MSFD is in a key role here because it covers the marine ecosystems most comprehensively, but at the same time, we still don't know much about the legal bindingness of that directive, and it has been quite unenforced also towards the member states from substantive aspects. So I would say that I welcome this Ocean Pact as a potential to pay also more attention to this, but it's really the key what we do with the existing policies, especially the MSFD, that is the solution here, in my opinion.
Yeah, thank you for that reflection. Let's hope that the Oceans Pact can then deliver on some of that. Let's move on then to the sectoral policies and specifically the case of fisheries. And I'll turn over to Jonas. Can you tell us a bit about what the coherence picture looks like for the fisheries-related policies? What did you find out about coherence there?
Yes, thank you. We did when we did our coherence analysis on an EU level. We got 5 different clusters, and 2 of them were environmental clusters, like the one Suvi Tuli just presented, and then we had 3 of them that were sectoral, where we look at both the environmental part and the sectoral policies with economic incentives. And there are similarities and there are differences on how to approach this, where we can see that the policies that address the both and the sectoral policies, there we have more clashes, which makes it in certain sense more obvious on what to look for, because we can see that they are really going against each other, and finding it kind of way into coherence is quite easy in some ways. At the same time, it's more difficult in certain sense to actually compare them and look at them, because the instruments are usually quite different. We have the tensions, but we also have usually different kinds of instruments. For example, sectoral policies are often in the form of regulations, while the environmental policies often are directives, and directives have to be implemented more in a sense as well, and the roles of objectives are quite different. But when we looked at fisheries, we also had the biodiversity objectives of the European Green Deal as the kind of goal to what we were comparing them towards. So the objectives of that was presented by Suvi Tuli just a few minutes ago. So I hope that's fresh in mind. And one of the big parts is, of course, the protected areas. And here we can see that the fishery is one of the main pressures of that. And if we look at the protected areas, we can find several different policies in the environmental part that handles that. We've got the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, we have the Birds Directive, and we have the Habitats Directive, or the Nature Directives, as Suvi Tuli called them. So we looked at these, and just as we did with the environmental policies, we looked at both the coherence of the objectives and the coherence of the instruments. And here we got the same kinds of guiding questions. And if we look at the fisheries, common fisheries policies, we can see that it has a long history in the EU. It dates back to 1970s, and at that point in time, we had no environmental considerations within that policy, which means that it has developed for decades and decades before we have even considered biodiversity. And what we could see in the objectives and later also in the instruments, there has been already developed that core logic that just oozes through the entire policy, which means that there is already a structure in place that looks mainly on social and economic sustainability and those aspects. And then you have added kind of an environmental logic, an outer logic to this core, which has created some issues. And that we can see in the objectives, that the objectives are very focused on social and economic aspects, while we have certain smaller objectives or objectives that maybe hasn't have the same breakthrough in the instruments. And as Gunnar said, objectives is one thing, having a certain goal or a vision or an ambition, but that has to come through in the instruments. And what we can see is that the instruments have focused on especially the economic aspects a lot, where it has to do with sustainably using this kind of ecological resource rather than protecting it from a biodiversity standpoint. And we have different kinds of instruments that are connected to biodiversity. The main one is probably the common fisheries policies, and that is directly connected to MPAs and allows member states to implement measures within MPA's zones. And what we can see is that that instrument has had an issue with actually breaking through, being really effective. And that is, of course, connected to this core logic that is not connected to this kind of issue. And one of the parts of that is the so-called joint recommendations, where member states are able to communicate with each other and issue joint recommendations to the Commission, and that then the Commission can take in them and perhaps do different kinds of measures. But what we have seen in practice is that member states have not sought to use these tools, as they have been deemed complicated, the process is very lengthy, and it has often led to very weak restrictions. So that hasn't been really effective in a certain way. And what we can see also is that these joint recommendations, they are not required to be issued by the member states. Neither is the Commission required to adopt the measures. So we can see that as an instrument that has not been as effective as it has hoped to be. And the solution has been to issue an action plan. So right now there's an action plan that's supposedly implemented and used. And within this kind of policy coherence analysis, an action plan is quite hard. It's difficult because it's not necessarily legally binding. And if you do an analysis and try to see on effective measures that are not legally binding will not have the impact in this analysis, and it's hard to predict what kind of effect it will actually have in the end. So that was what I wanted to present.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonas. So a lot more complexity added there by just having different approaches in these different sectors and them developing over different timelines. Yeah, so now we've heard both the theory and some practical examples about the first part of this, like how do you assess the level of coherence? But circling back to the beginning, Frauke told us that there was the second element to this assessment methodology that was also looking at understanding why there is coherence or incoherence. So I would like to give the word to Saskia and ask if you can tell us a bit more about this part of the assessment methodology.
Yes, of course. So this part is about understanding policy coherence. And so if we try to look at policy coherence, it's not a black box, but there are reasons for why the policy landscapes are coherent or incoherent. And so in our project, we have tried to group these explanations into what we call 3 explanatory factors. And those are governmental organizations, science, policy, society interfaces, and stakeholder involvement. And so basically these 3 are important factors that shape policy landscapes, both in the design phase, but also in the implementation. And if we analyze them more in detail, it can help us to answer why does incoherence occur and what can potentially be done to enhance policy coherence. So in our framework for each of these explanatory factors, we are providing more specific aspects to consider, and we give guiding questions for each of them.
I know that there are a lot of these guiding questions, but can you give us some concrete examples so that we understand a bit better?
Yeah, I can maybe explain each of the factors and zoom in with some concrete examples, but I won't be able to show all of them. So the first explanatory factor is what we call governmental organizations. So those are responsible for the design and the implementation of policies and laws. And that can span from ministries, agencies, or municipalities. And if specifically we look into the marine and coastal context, things are often quite complex and it's many organizations involved. And if we look at the landscape, they have different roles and responsibilities. They might, for instance, operate at specific governance levels, just at the national level or the subnational level. They might be responsible for only one sector, be it agriculture or fisheries, or they might have a limited geographical coverage, for instance, only focusing on the coastal zone. And so if we want to understand why incoherences emerge, we need to look at these interactions between all of these governmental organizations involved. And for that, we propose different aspects to consider. The first one is about coordination mechanisms. So obviously, this is complex and coordination is required at many different levels and scales. And one of them is at the transboundary scale. So it's clear that marine ecosystems don't stop at the national borders. And this is why maritime spatial planning processes should consider such transboundary effects. And this requires that there is coordination with the neighboring states in place, for instance, through formalized platforms. But without coordination, there is a risk to create regional incoherence, meaning that, for instance, the maritime spatial plan of one country might designate an offshore energy area right next to a biodiversity-rich area of another state, creating negative effects. Another thing we can look at is the mandates and the roles. If, for instance, a policy issue, let's say flood management, involves many organizations, this can lead to uncoordinated efforts. So clarifying the roles or designating a lead organization can help to have more and better coherent approaches. But another issue as well is when organizations have too siloed or restricted mandates, which might hinder holistic management. So one example I can mention is from our Norwegian case study, where we find that marine management is quite disconnected from the management of freshwater and the coast. And one potential explanation we can bring is that the management of freshwater and marine waters is under the responsibility of 2 different departments, even though it's the same ministry. And a third aspect to consider is what we call power dynamics. So obviously, when you have different governmental organizations involved, they have different powers and political relevance within either a state or a region. And if you look into these power dynamics and how they influence decision-making processes, this can also help to understand why some policies are being adopted despite being incoherent with some of the other policy objectives. I'll move on to the second category, which we call science, policy, society interfaces. And so broadly, this describes the processes of knowledge which is being used and produced in the policy-making processes. And I will not go too much in detail about this because we have a separate seminar just about this next week. But very brief to just give one example is the question about data and knowledge. Is data and knowledge which is relevant to the policy issue available or accessible? So if this is unavailable, or if it's siloed across different organizations, or if the data format is not standardized, this can have implications for policy coherence. One example is when you conduct a strategic impact assessment, to identify the sites for offshore renewables. And there it's critical to have comprehensive data about the marine environment to make the informed decisions. But if this is not available, then this limits the environmental considerations in the decision-making process. And this points to the need to have more harmonized and better and shared data and open access tools available, not only at the national, but even at the transboundary scale. And moving on to the third explanatory factor, which is the involvement of stakeholders. This looks into the participatory processes and how decision-making is informed or influenced by perspectives from stakeholders. And generally, we see that more inclusive involvement processes can increase coherence because they provide different insights of perspectives and how actors are being affected. Something to consider is, have all relevant stakeholders been consulted, or are they being, and how are they being involved? And again, an example that I can mention from our Norwegian case study, where we have been looking into a coastal region that is under severe pressure, and the government launched an action plan to address these challenges. And before they went into this very detailed planning of policy measures, they held a startup conference with over 260 stakeholders from different sectors and interests. And this supported the identification of the pressures and what the plan should focus on. So this provides a positive example of how diverse stakeholders can be involved to ensure that the multiple perspectives are being considered. But it's also important to note that stakeholder involvement does not always guarantee more coherence. So in a way, if you have a powerful stakeholder that dominates, it can even have the opposite effect. And it can also make processes more complex and lengthy if conflicts arise.
Thank you, Saskia. I think we can now move on to the Q&A session, and I will keep you straight here with me because one of the questions that we got from the audience is very relevant to what you have just told us about. And this question was about how can we ensure policy coherence when the responsibility for implementing these policies is divided across different actors with different political agendas?
Yeah, I think that resonates very well with this first category I had about governmental organizations. And so I think to have more policy coherence, what is needed is more integrated approaches where like the interaction between different sectoral policies are recognized. And I think it's important to note that some trade-offs will always remain. And maybe policy coherence is more about finding synergies where we think that they are seemingly conflicting objectives. So looking, for instance, into agriculture and biodiversity of the environment, if we mainstream some of the environmental considerations into the agricultural policies, that can have actually some positive effects for both objectives, such as crops that sequester more carbon or some of the eco-scheme rules. But in order to get there and to identify what potential win-win synergies we can find, what is needed is the coordination mechanisms. And so one often adopted strategy is to have, for instance, multi-sectoral steering groups or committees where different policies can consult and provide input, or it's also about having an overarching strategy or management plan that fosters the common vision between the policies.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that makes a lot of sense that we have to have this collaboration and coordination. Thank you, Saskia. Another question that came up from the audience was the topic of marine spatial planning and what the role of marine spatial planning is in delivering policy coherence. And I think I will direct this question to all our online speakers. Was it Gunnar? Would you like to start and comment on this question?
Yes, I can start. Potentially, marine spatial planning can be a very, very forceful instrument to make bigger coherence between several interests. However, starting with the extent to which it works towards the environment, which has been key to CrossGov. Having worked as a spatial planner myself, I can reassure you that it's absolutely possible to work with spatial planning without taking the environment much into account. So I think one of the first key issues here is to see to what extent ecosystem-based management through the Marine Spatial Framework Directive has been put into practice, and whether the marine spatial plans can be, so to say, embedded in these, taking the knowledge about the ecosystem into consideration. And a key issue here is that you have strategic environmental assessments or environmental impact assessments performed as a part of the allocation of ocean space to different uses. So I think that is at least one consideration. You could also mention the transboundary issues, which is an issue both for the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and for the marine spatial plans.
Thank you, Gunnar. Definitely this transboundary question is an important one. I was just wondering, Suvituuli, did you have any thoughts on this as well? You touched on the MSP briefly in your presentation.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Laura. So yeah, we definitely see that there's a lot of potential with the MSP to also supplement the biodiversity instruments in these biodiversity directives and the nature restoration law. First of all, as I was talking about, especially the nature directives that established the Natura 2000 framework, they are a little bit shallow when it comes to especially like the deeper sea ecosystem and seafloor bottom habitats. And that's why we need complementary instruments like establishing MPAs based on national legislation, but also, for instance, the MSP could be a way of ensuring that when we have habitats that are not covered by the Habitats Directive, for instance, we could still maybe use the MSP to not direct economic activities there. So even if it's not really a protection area, we can use it that way. Also, what the MSP could do is that we also use it in order to ensure the effectiveness of protected areas. So we use the MSP in a way that we don't really situate the most damaging activities right next to the protection area, for instance. So there's a lot of potential from this respect. However, we also found out that the current marine spatial planning directive and its implementation, they display several weaknesses that really hamper the MSP working this way. So first of all, like following up what Gunnar said, the directive doesn't really require that environmental protection is taken as a starting point for the MSP, but it's rather only one of the interests that should be balanced when these planning decisions are made. So it's not really necessarily so that the MSP will be a strong environmental protection instrument. And the second one is that the directive doesn't prescribe that the plan needs to be legally binding. So in some countries, I know it has been implemented in more binding way, in which capacity it actually directs what activities take place and where. Whereas in some other countries, the MSP might be more about informational tool and something to bring stakeholders together, but it doesn't have the legal effect on the actual adoption of activities.
Thank you. So it's also about how different countries are implementing these directives. I see we have no more questions in the chat. If the audience, if you have any last questions, we have a minute to go. You can add them quickly now. If not, then I will ask, are we on? I will ask my speakers. We have a question in the chat. Do we have a new post here? Oh yeah, okay. So we have a question about the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and about how it could be made more enforceable given the legal unclarities that exist today, and would a legal revision be a good way here to also integrate it better with the Marine Spatial Planning Directive? And I think that question goes straight back to you, Suvituuli.
Yes, indeed. No, but that's the real question in my opinion as well. Well, we have studied the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and we find that also there the objective of achieving good environmental status, we can see that it could be an obligation of result or an obligation of best effort on the member states. So in either case, we could see that there is substantive content there It just hasn't really been outlined, for instance, by the Court of Justice of the EU, or taken very seriously by the member states, or strongly by the Commission either. So one way that this could be addressed is enforcement action by the Commission, for instance, against the member state, for instance, building infringement cases where the purpose is to get a ruling from the court on exact this, like what is the scope of obligation. Other way in which the court could rule on this, of course, is that there's a preliminary ruling reference from national courts, for instance, when it concerns permitting of offshore wind, for instance. That question might easily end up in the court. What is the legal bindingness of the MSFD? However, for some reason, the national courts haven't been asking these questions during the implementation of the MSFD, because we still don't know, we still don't have any cases of this or any rulings from the court. So I see that the court could be in a key role, but we would have to get there some way. Revision of the MSFD, I also see that is necessary for the fact that the deadline for achieving good status is already in the past. So even if we could read the obligation in a way that it is an obligation of result or best efforts on member states, we cannot really, it's very hard to enforce it and know what the legal content is today if the deadline has already passed 5 years ago. So I do also see that absolutely necessary, that this time frame thing needs to be addressed somehow. But I do believe that just a strengthening of trying to understand a little bit better what are the obligations under the MSFD, it can also then influence outside just the implementation of marine strategies. So it can then become more binding towards the MSPs as well. So that's why I see MSFD in a key role also in further developments.
Thank you for those reflections. This is, I think, all the time we have to address questions and thoughts from the speakers as well. So with that, I just want to repeat the advertisement for the next webinar, which will be next week on the 3rd of April. And this will be specifically looking at the science policy interface, science policy society interface, and the role that this plays in policy coherence. And you will learn about how the assessment for that can be applied, and also some examples from the CrossGov case studies. And with that, if you want to provide feedback on today's session, there should be a QR code or a link for you to do so. And also a reminder, as I said at the beginning, that this is going to be a series of webinars that will become available as an online training course from the CrossGov project, which should be launching this summer. Yes, and with that, all that remains to say is thank you very much to my speakers, and thank you very much to the audience today for your interest, and have a good rest of the week.
Thank you.